Hello everyone and welcome to part 2 of making your helicopter. Now if you watched part 1, you would have gotten to this point where you have a more or less stable helicopter, able to fly, able to do most of your basic helicopter things. You learned how to tune up a gyroscope. I didn't show you how to program these things, and actually that's one thing we're going to cover here, as well as how to make some basic helicopter functionality that will really help you succeed when it comes to flying missions and stuff like that. Now, to get to this point, I'm expecting you know a bit more than in the past video. This is a beginner intermediate video with microcontrollers, PIDs, stuff like that. But in essence, to get here, you'll want to know the basic things about making a helicopter work, plugging all this stuff in, obviously how to make an engine, but we're going to take that a step further and expand on it. So let's begin. So depending on your helicopter's handling, you have a lot of different options. Now you can see this helicopter handles pretty well. I would say it's a little slow on the roll. Like, it's not very fast on the roll, but that is kind of stable. Otherwise, up down is quite good. I showed you how to use Alt to set trim parameters, and overall it seems to be working pretty well. Now one thing is if I push up the throttle all the way to 100%, you may start to see it kind of like shake, especially when you push the collective upward. You can see how it's going down and then back up, it started to shake. So that's one thing that we have to look into fixing. One thing that, in this case, what we can do is go to our gyroscope. So in our gyroscope, there are parameters here for max throttle, minimum throttle, roll pitch stuff. So if you find your creation is kind of out of hand for any one of these, you can adjust these parameters. What I mean by out of hand is if your roll is happening way too fast, you can tune this down. Same with pitch, same with yaw. Now I'd say everything seems to be working okay, except for my roll. Now I could just turn my sensitivity up, let's say to 20%, and let's try to turn our max throttle to 70 and see what happens. So I have put my actual throttle all the way to 100. And now, when we take off, it still has that very nice responsive collective. Alright, and you can see that it rolls way faster. So this is a good amount of roll, so you just turn up your actual sensitivity on your seat, and you're able to get something like this. Now let's see, if I go down and quickly back up, we're still getting that shaking, which tells me that we are currently putting out way too much power through these rotors. Regardless, you could see that this engine's redlining, and in the previous video I mentioned, yes, you could leave it like that. It will maybe, actually with these guys, they shouldn't really overheat if it's at that 20, especially if you have a radiator, but that is one thing that could happen. So now we get into the actual programming side of things, because what I mentioned here, or what we had here, is literally the gyroscope and just one threshold gate to turn on the fan and to turn on the actual gyroscope auto hover. I didn't show what happens if you don't have auto hover, but trust me, you can flip your helicopter in rolls, so you really don't want that. Now one thing that I've done is strayed away from using this type of throttle. The reason why is because once you set a predefined throttle, you don't need this anymore. In fact, this is a very dated type of system that won't really help us. So what I like to do is have a one button approach, or one seat approach, if you will. So rather here than pressing hotkey 1 for the starter, pressing 2 or 3 to throttle up, as I showed you previously, which works, you actually make a microcontroller that can start the engine and keep it at a nice RPS for you to fly. So for this, we're going to grab our empty microcontroller, and what I'm going to have to do is add a few things. Obviously, you need your seat. This is your on-off button. You need to have a throttle. going all the way to your engine. That's going to be an output. And we're going to want an RPS input so we can actually keep track of what is happening with our engine and potentially change the throttle as needed so it is stable. We're just going to call this heli test in this case and go into here. Now here we can organize all this as needed. Now in theory, just ignoring the RPS, what we can have is, oh, and we do need a fourth one, my apologies, for the starter. So this will be a on-off output for the starter right here. Okay. So simply what happens is you push the on-off. What's going to happen is it flicks a switch box. The switch box goes to the throttle. It will change your throttle from 0, and when it's on, to whatever number you have set. Now, easiest is just to set 100%, and that's going to go to our throttle. Quite simple, quite easy, but that's not always what we want, especially in the case when we're giving too much power. But for now, let's just leave it like this. We'll also want to use a capacitor to kind of start off the engine. It's going to push the starter on for a set time, but you can't just put a capacitor, you also have to put a pulse. Toggle to push. So what's going to happen is you push your on off, it toggles the pulse into the capacitor, into the starter, and we can set this to 2 seconds even. So now what's going to happen when we push the button is we're going to go constant 1, 100% throttle, go into the throttle, we're going to turn the starter on. So in the helicopter, we press 1, so you can hear the starter stopped, and now we have power. So that's just a nice one button solution for everything. But take a look at that. That is because I removed what is going to turn on my auto hover. So the RPS, or the value coming out of previously what I had coming here for my throttle, is now gone. So simple solution if you want to use this is to just whatever is going into your throttle, put that into your threshold gate. But I have an even better option for you. We don't even need this anymore, because now when I push 1, it's a toggle. So why don't we just set that to fan on off and set that to the gyro. So now pressing 1 turns on our engines, turns on our fan, turns on our gyro. Everything's happy. It's going to fly. And we just made a one button solution to starting up the thing. Now we're still going to have the RPS jumping. So for that, we're actually best off coming in here and adding something. But before we get too far, I do want to correct something I said earlier. And that is there's two different RPSs here. There's the RPS coming out of the engine that we can measure here. And then there's the RPS that actually goes into the path of the rotors after that gearbox. So we do have two different RPSs. Now, it is quite interesting, and what I read on the internet is that people are reporting that something like 25 RPS going into the rotors is what's needed. So you have two different things you can control. We can either plug in the RPS into this and have it such that we want 25 RPS going into the rotors, or we could plug in the RPS from the small engine and control it from redlining. Now what I'm going to do for beginners, just for starting off, is to control it from redlining. So what I'm going to do is put a PID here, and we are going to have a set point of, call it 17 RPS. I'd be happy with 17 RPS, and that is our set point, sorry. And then our process variable is our actual RPS. So we're going to be changing our RPS based on wanting that. So that's what we have here. Yeah, the on-off is going to be activated by this, and the output is what's going to go into this on value. So rather than the 1, we're actually going to have this. Now, as I always do, I always set off with something quite small here. So we're just going to put something like this. Maybe not 0.1, but just 0.01, yeah, like that. So 0.1 instead of 0.01, and down there a little bit smaller. And let's see how this works. One thing that I'm also curious is, what is the rotor RPS? So I will actually connect one here and we can kind of figure it out together. So I'm just going to take this there, and this one is our engine RPS. And what I do want to also find out, and that's the middle one, is what our engine throttle is coming out of this. So that's really going to also play a factor. So this is our rotor RPS, this is our throttle coming into the engine, and this is our engine RPS. Let's see what we get. So press 1. Okay. We're hanging out at close to 15 engine RPS. This is 44 rotor RPS, and the throttle is 0.2. Now, if I have to give it collective, obviously that will increase. So you can see here, as I'm pushing forward, just let me get out of the hangar here so we don't end up hitting the roof. Anyways, as we're out here, if I push up, this increases and we are going upward. Now, we're not going upward very quickly, but we are going up. And you will note now that we are spinning to the left, even though we have these trims. So what I want to say is, when you play with these parameters, these values will no longer do anything. They won't really work because you set them to a very specific type of control. So I just set everything to 0. We're going to delete them after, but you could see here we're getting a rotor RPS 33. Our engine throttle is fine, and our engine RPS is dropped substantially. So actually I don't like that. I would like it to be a little bit higher rather than doing that. So I think that the PID needs some better tuning. So after some fine tuning, I was able to actually get it working properly. You could see the gauges are in a nice spot. My engine RPS, it does fluctuate a little bit. Obviously, if we're putting collective or not, we're putting in kind of pressure, or we're putting, when it's going up, obviously it's going to spike up a little bit because we're putting, we need extra strength. Like, look at that, it drops a little. But overall, look at the throttle. It's hanging out here, but when we give it more up, the throttle obviously changes. Down, it can even drop, because when we're going down, we're not even using that engine power. But look at the rotor RPS. And the rotor RPS is so high, especially if we go down and quickly up like that, it starts to shake. So let's see if we can reduce that rotor RPS. But what value did I put, may you ask? Because this is obviously important. I just put 0.3 for proportional. And I had my RPS here, like I said, set at 17. And that got me the nice, stable, almost stable system that I have. Now, with that, we can go in here and adjust this. Let's lower it. Let's put it to 9 to 5 and see what my rotor RPS ends up if we have something like this. So this is going to shoot up to that 17 or close to. This is 0.2 and this is 29. Okay, so that's closer to that lower number, and we don't even need a lot of throttle. So if I give it power, can we even take off? So that's the question. Is this enough rotor RPS to even take off from the ground? And you could see that the throttle here is not going any higher because we're limiting ourselves to that RPS. So in this case, I would say no, it's not. We have to actually try to put this to be a little higher. Let's go 2 to 1. So with 2 to 1, we're at 16. This is 32. And if we give it extra power, we're trying to lift up, it's at 30. This is 0.46, and this is at 15. So it's actually not really going up here. So we got to go back to the drawing board. This is 5 to 2, and now we're up. So our rotor is at 38 or thereabouts, and our throttle is at that kind of 0.5 mark, and it can jump, and our RPS for our engine is where we want it. So here we're getting a much nicer rotor RPS. Now, of course, massive fluctuations, such as when we go down quickly and change do cause shaking. So for that, we can actually try to enter here and see if we can reduce that throttle. So I did reduce it, and what you have now is an effect where it just changes slower. So it doesn't do the shakes, and you can see that the RPS for the rotor is much more stable. But what the downside is it takes way too long now to lift up. It's not really peppy, it's quite slow. So what I recommend is finding a happy medium, some sort of balance where maybe it doesn't have to change so much. So let's try 75%. Now remember what I said about we set our RPS here to be limited, but once we find out what our RPS should be for the helicopter, we could actually go and do something else, and that is, rather than setting the engine RPS to be 17, we set our rotor RPS to be a certain value. So I'm teaching you how to do both. Like I said, this way we can do it for sure, as I pointed out. So let's just see what kind of thing we're getting. So in this case, we're able to climb and rise and whatnot. We're at 38 to call it 36 RPS. Now that jump or shaking came from changing very drastically. Our engine RPS also does dip as well, but let's see if we take this and just set our rotor RPS to 37. Let's try. In here, instead of connecting this to the engine, I'm going to connect it now to the torque meter there, and we'll try setting this to 37 or 38. Let's try 38 and just see how that works. So now we're flying, and if I do that quick sudden dropping and then press up arrow, we get a little bit of shakes, but you could see not as much. It just takes longer for it to react. So keep in mind that you're getting a little bit of slower reaction, but that's how you make it more stable. So as a general rule, I would say for helicopters, the slower things change in terms of the RPS and the controls, the more stable they will be. You don't want jittery, you don't want it kind of flopping around, because that will not cause stability. So anyways, there we have it. Using these values here, 65%, I was able to kind of reduce that shakiness, and now I even set this RPS to the rotor RPS rather than engine, but both do the exact same thing, so it's just your personal preference that you can follow there. I would say that that's working pretty good. I will remove the trims here for the time being. Now we're going to jump right into making an altitude hold. So we're going to start off with my empty microcontroller, just has basically nothing inside it. And what we're going to do is add a few nodes. Obviously the on-off for turning on the altitude hold and turning it off. We will need a number input that is going to be from our up-down or collective, and this is coming from our seat. So if you remember, we put the seat up down is the collective, and that's going to actually shoot it out to the gyroscope collective. And what that's going to do is it adds a path for the seat to go to the gyroscope, or for whatever parameters we're setting to control the altitude. I'll explain that when we get out into the actual helicopter itself. And the last thing we'll need is another number input for the altitude, and that's obviously imperative. In here, I always start off by organizing these, and at a basic level, your seat up down should go to your gyroscope. And then we're going to add stuff in here to also make our altitude hold function. So I start off with a numerical switch box. We are going to take this value, put it into there. And of course, the seat up down, which is what you're trying to control, is when it's off. When you turn it on with this, Well, then you go to the on value. And the on value is going to use a PID. So PIDs are super, super useful for stuff like this, and they are going to help us, in essence, make our collective adjust and keep our altitude that we desire. From some trial and errors, I found that a good starting point is 0.3, 0.0001, and 1. We're just going to start off with that and see how that works in the helicopter. Now, this altitude is from the altitude sensor, so that's actually maybe worthwhile putting here. But the point is, that's your current altitude. So that's what the helicopter is at right now, and that will be your process variable. Now, what you're trying to set it to is what the altitude is when you push this button. So to do that, we're going to want the memory register. Now, the memory register, in essence, will save a value and store it for you to reference. And what we can do is the number to store will be the current altitude coming into here. And what we need to do, again, is put a pulse. So the pulse will enter the set when we push this button. So I push the on-off button and pulse gets initiated, it hits the set, and whatever we're currently at gets stored. That is what's going to go into this set point. Now here we can do reset, and of course the reset is the not. When the on-off button is not pressed, it's reset. But keep in mind, your on-off button also has to trigger the PID. So the on-off button does a few things here. It's going to hit the pulse to set the memory register. It's going to reset the thing. It's going to activate the PID, and it's going to switch the signal. Now, one thing you can do, you don't have to do this, but you can do this, is you can also put a pulse here for the reset, such that when it's not on, it just gets pulsed and resets it. It doesn't keep resetting it. It's just a little programming trick. Otherwise, you have to think, like, if you just had this here, going through there, going into there, it's like you're hitting off, like a bunch of times on the keyboard, and it's just pretty much endlessly hitting reset, which there's no need for that. So these are the values, and this we plug into this on value here. And now what's going to happen is when we push our on off, and I'm going to rename that to enable altitude hold. So when this happens, we are going to keep our altitude. So I'm going to update this into the helicopter, and you see it's right there, which isn't great, but it is what it is. And then I'm going to adjust this to put a digital display, just so I can nicely see the altitude we're at. We will put a toggle button. Again, you can use an instrument panel. I'd prefer to use an instrument panel, but it's up to you. I do have another tutorial for making instrument panels. Anyways, you're going to take the toggle button. That's going to enable the altitude hold, and we're going to call this altitude hold. Now what you need is, from your seat, find your up and down. So right here, it's the up and down. That's going to go into the up and down. Then the gyro collective is going into this. So what you've done is you've inserted the altitude hold function between the seat and the gyroscope. Now, if you make the mistake and have your up-down stay on the gyroscope, you can take the stabilized up-down, throw it into the seat up-down in essence, and then you'd have your gyro collective going to your rotor collective. Well, now you've bypassed the gyro. The gyro is only now enabled when you're moving the seat up and down, and it's not enabled when the PID is controlling the rotor. So that's not a good practice. You want your gyroscope to be involved. So like I said, we're going to grab this from the seat. We're going to throw this into the gyroscope, and we're going to take the stabilized up down and put it into the collective here. The last thing we need is the altitude sensor, and we're just going to grab that from here. I always throw it up sort of on the top of my helicopter like that, just so it's in a uniform position. You could also hide it somewhere. And then we're going to take that, put it into here, check that it doesn't have electricity, and make sure our buttons are working and enabled. Last thing I'm going to do is take the altitude and throw it onto the digital display here, which is going to be my altitude. Before you push the altitude hold button, nothing should be different. You should be able to go up and down to your heart's desire. But once you push this, if you try to push up and down, I'm holding up and down now on the keyboard, I'm pressing down, well, nothing's happening. It's keeping this altitude, and it's no longer changing, as you can see here. So it's really retaining it. Now, it does seem to be varying a little bit. We're just going to make sure that our trim isn't set. But keep in mind that it's not a perfect system, but if it goes up too high, it will start to drop back down. So that's, in essence, it's holding the altitude. And even if I turn on, let's say, very high winds to kind of throw the helicopter around, even still, it should still retain that altitude that we want it to be at. When I disable this, then of course I can go up and down and whatever I want to be doing. But again, once this is pressed, and actually a really good test for this, by the way, is be holding the up, for example. I'm literally holding up, we're gaining altitude, and now I'm going to press this. And now we overshot, and we're going to correct. We go back down, and then we go back up. So you can see it kind of jigged around a bit, and it got to where we wanted it to. So it, wherever you are when you press the button, that's what it's going to want to retain. So if we're going down, same situation. I press this, yeah, it goes down, but then it should correct itself and make its way back up to where it was when I pressed the button. So you can see that this system is working, and it can auto-correct. So obviously those tiny changes in decimal place aren't going to matter, because it's going to fluctuate up and down in a very minor level. Now, yes, I do realize we're spinning. We're going to handle that next. But first, one other thing I want to do with my altitude hold. This is something that I actually learned and discovered and enabled recently, and I'm going to share that with you. So I don't actually have this on all of my helicopters. I actually have this more on my submarines, but this is something that I really like to do. So this is your basic altitude hold. And the reason I'm saying basic is because in this instant, you're not actually, it's not a live updating system. It's just what we're currently, when we press the button, what it goes to. When I'm talking about a live updating system is the second you're not trying to go up and down, pressing up and down arrow keys, it starts to hold the altitude. And this is actually a superior system to the point you don't even need to enable the altitude, because the enable altitude will be optional. It'll be good for you to stay put if you're trying to hold an altitude that kind of tough to get to or whatever, but you won't actually need it. So what I recommend doing is this. You'll place a threshold gate, and you'll attach your seat up and down to it. Now keep in mind that seat up and down obviously is registering your movement, your desire to go up and down. But if you set it to between negative 0.1 and 0.1, that it means that it's pretty much zero. And it means that you're not trying to go up and down anymore. So if you're not trying to go up and down anymore, we actually want the same system to be kicked on, that is enable our altitude hold. So you'd put that here, and all you'll want to do is put an OR function. So previously when you had any of these points, well, now you're just doing the OR for all of them. So I'm just holding control and I applied it to all of them. So now when we set the enable button, or we have this threshold, well, then we're going to want it to keep our altitude. So now, even if you're weighted down or whatever, it's going to want to keep whatever altitude. It's going to keep you stable. It's going to prevent the helicopter from slowly drifting downward in an instant where you just want it to kind of remain put. Now you can put an extra 0 here to kind of fine tune this. So really when it's at 0, it's holding its altitude. But regardless, that is a system you can add. And you don't even change any of the nodes. It should work the same until you let go of the up and down. And now you'll see it's going to kind of do a little bit of jumping. And then it will catch itself. And you're not going to be falling. You're going to keep at your altitude. But if you press down, yeah, it starts to go down. And then if you hit that 0 mark, it'll retain your altitude. So this is a very clever function, just so you don't have to constantly enable this. The good place to enable this is if you do not want to move up and down anymore, and then at least if you hit the arrow keys, nothing will happen. So you can't by mistake. For example, this is good if you're just above the water and you don't want to fall into the water, you turn on that. Next is that spinning. Remember, I turned off the trim, and now we were spinning the whole time we set the altitude, and it was almost giving me a headache here. So what I want to do is fix that, and we're going to make a microcontroller just to prevent that. And again, why this is better than just having a plain old simple trim is because even if you change any of these parameters, you're still going to end up maintaining that yaw. You're not going to be jumping around. So yaw input, yaw output, and that's going to, I'll show you, to the gyro. And the yaw input, this is the seat. And then what we're going to want is the rotational velocity. And these are numbers, all of them. This one is input. This is the only output. The one going to the gyroscope, that is an output. I'm just going to change the size of this. See how it fits there. It's fine. Well, it kind of dug into the helicopter, so I'm just going to hold Control, copy it, Control Z, rotate it, boom. Now it's here. If you didn't follow along, it's fine. Anyways, this is our yaw hold. And the point of the yaw hold is to prevent the helicopter from constantly spinning around and around. So in here, we're just going to find these and place them as needed, like that. Now you're going to detect a pattern here. We're going to take a PID. We're also going to take a threshold gate. The threshold gate is going to be reading from the seat. It's also going to be negative 0.1 and positive 0.1. So when the seat yaw is these things, that means we don't want it to be yawing anymore. That's going to enable the PID. That's also going to switch the switch box from the seat controlling the switch box. I'm just going to move this down there so it's easier to see, to here. So again, from the top, seat goes off. And that's pretty much your standard control. When we're at 0 on the seat, we want it to switch. We're going to switch it to the on value, which is coming from the PID, which is the rotational velocity going into the process variable. And you don't have to do this, but I like to do this because just for this instant where I put 0 as my set point, and boom. Now, one thing to keep in mind, rotational velocity is a very, very small number, and it kind of makes the PID a little bit tough to read it. So I'm just going to wire in this function, and we're just going to take x multiplied by 10. So that just increases that rotational velocity. Inside the PID, we're going to put 1, 0.01, and 4. So these numbers are kind of what I've been playing with. We're going to spawn this into the creation. And now, same steps, exact same thing. So our yawing is whatever is going into here. So it is from our left and right. That is going to go to the rotational, to the yaw seat input. So the seat itself is going into this. And our output is going into the gyroscope. So now we've just spliced in this microcontroller here. These ones are confusing. I'm going to delete them. They weren't doing anything. We're going to move this down here like that. And we need that rotational velocity. So if you type in speed sensor, you get angular speed sensor and linear speed sensor. So your angular speed sensor is the one that has the rotations. And I'm going to throw it up here as well next to the rotor. I know someone is saying you don't have to put it so close to the rotor. You could move it to wherever because it is one body. But I like it being close to the rotor because then you're really capturing the axis of spinning. And that's going to go into the rotational velocity. If we fire it up, you'll see something bad happens. It starts to shake itself to death. So you can right away see that there's something wrong with the values. If you notice that, then you got to get into the controller here and tune this up. So I'm just going to tune everything down a little bit and see what happens now. And once it's stable, it still seems to happen. So just a good lesson in tuning a PID. It does take a bit of patience. Third time was the charm, so I put 0.1, 0.001, and 1. Now keep in mind, the first values I gave you were from my larger helicopter, and they work perfectly there. So these are not one-size-fits-all calculations. If you have a smaller helicopter, you have to actually use different values. So you can see now, we come up, and now it's not spinning. And if we press left and right, it starts to spin, which is what we want. If we let go, it kind of catches itself. It shakes a little, so we can still tune it down. But you'll notice one thing is that we are kind of moving. We're moving a little bit in the left direction. So what I do recommend is pressing Alt and pressing D until you kind of find when it stops moving. Now, in this case, it's like 0.1, maybe a little more, and now it's not moving. So now we're fixed in position. I'm sure you can make a PID to prevent it from moving, from rolling left and right. In this case, we're countering our roll by using 0.13. But for me, the roll itself is a fairly small detail. So that is not too big a deal, and that is related to the trim axis 1, so we can use 0.13. And in this case now, spawning it in, it's always going to be preset to that 0.13, and it'll prevent the helicopter from kind of moving off post. So you can see now, if we make ourselves up a little bit like this, we do get a slight bit of movement, and it catches itself. And now it should be relatively stable. You could see it's moving a little bit, but then it kind of stops. So anyways, it seems that it takes a little bit to catch itself, especially as the RPS build up. But once they've built it themselves up, you get a super stable helicopter that pretty much sits in one location. And this is exactly what we want if we want to do tight rescues and stuff like that. I did show you how to tune and change your PIDs. So yes, if this yaw hold is still too firm, you can always tune it down a little bit. Just keep dropping the number, adding decimal points if it is still shaky, but I don't hate how this is. Maybe I'd want to put this to 0.1. Otherwise, I'd say this was okay. Now, a really useful other thing for helicopters is position hold. And that is going to counter any wind that you may encounter or anything like that. It keeps your helicopter fixed to whatever position you are in. By the way, you could also use a compass sensor instead of the rotational velocity or angular speed. If you use a compass, you literally do it in the exact same way. You just put your compass, make sure it's the compass sensor, and you're going to position it facing forward, and that is going to be the compass reading going into this. So rather than yaw hold, or rather than the rotational velocity, it's not going to be 0, but you're going to put the exact same thing you did in the other one, which is the memory function. If you remember, I'm talking about the altitude hold. So whatever, and this is no longer rotational, this is now compass. The compass is the stored setting. You'd use a pulse to set this. This would go into here, and that becomes your set point. So that is a secondary way to do this, but I don't mind the velocity one, just because then it kind of counters it as it comes versus setting itself. But both are going to get you the exact same final result. In fact, the compass might be a little bit better even. The position hold is the biggest one that we're going to make for this helicopter, the biggest microcontroller. So we'll start off with our empty, and we have to add a bunch of nodes here. We actually have to have 8 of them. So you can expand it in either direction. Position hold, always good to label them. So we're going to need a few things. We're going to need obviously the on-off button, or enable. That's the first thing. And again, you could put it into an instrument panel if you want. We'll need a compass, and that's going to be an input. And then we need 2 other numerical inputs that are the GPS X and the GPS Y. So these 2 things, or all of these, are things coming into the microcontroller, information coming in. Then there are 2 more ones that are also coming in, and that is the roll coming out of the seat and the pitch coming out of the seat. So these are things that are required for you to input. And then of course we now have to add, I'm sure you can guess, the roll going to the gyro and the pitch going to the gyro. And that's going to be a number output. So in this case, it's information going out. Now this is just the starting point. I do recommend, as always, to identify which ones are going to the left, going to the right. We're going to stack them all here, and then I'll see what they are. We're going to group the GPS X and Y together because they're kind of similar. We're going to group the seat, roll, and pitch together, and the compass can be closer to the GPS. The enable button's there, and these guys can go here. So now that we've arranged it, I'm sure you can predict what we're going to do next. Like before, our enable position hold button has to be toggled. When it's toggled, it's going to set certain parameters in play. So what you're going to need is your memory function, and that memory function will be repeated twice for each of the GPSs. So we're going to have GPS X and GPS Y as the numbers that are stored. Now, in addition to that, I'm sure you could guess, you need a PID. And I'm sure now you're seeing a pattern, because different but similar, all of these. So we're going to have the GPS X being the process variable, and then the stored number is the set point. Likewise here, stored number is the set point, GPS Y is the process variable, and your position hold is going to obviously trigger the PID. You also need a pulse. So you've probably seen a lot of repetition, but by the time you watch this video, you're going to be a pro at working these these commands. So we'll set these, we'll set this, the pulse will set these things, and the not pulse will reset the memory registers. So the PIDs have to be programmed, and through trial and error, what I've got is 0.1, 0.00001, a lot of zeros there, and 0.4. Or 0.04, my bad. And you'll repeat it here. So 0.1, 0.00001, and 0.04. That's coming into the PID. Now, there's obviously a relationship needed to make these values do something. And that's where trigonometry comes in, because you can't simply just say, okay, have my GPS X go into my pitch and my roll. No, you have to have some math. Now, obviously, before we get into anything else, I will just show you something else. the pitch and the roll have to go through numerical switch boxes. When we have it off, that's what's going to the roll. When we have this off, that's what's going to the pitch. When you turn on your position hold, well, that's the number that has to come into here and into here. So we're going to need some functions. First, we're going to need a single function for the compass. Now, this is again trigonometry and stuff, but pretty much you'll want x multiplied by pi squared multiplied by -1. So that is the first thing here coming out of the compass. And then you'll need a bigger function, 2 of them, similar but different, going here. Now the first thing is x is going to be x in both of these instances. The GPS y is going to be y in both these instances, and compass is z. So that's kind of easy to memorize. And this just goes into this one, and this just goes into the bottom one there for the roll. So I've arranged it such that this should work, but you need to now fill these functions in. So these functions now are a little bit more complex, and again, you need some trigonometry and stuff. So x multiplied by sine, z in brackets, plus y multiplied by cos, and then in brackets the z. Down here, we're going to need a different but similar thing again. X multiplied by cos in brackets z minus y multiplied by sine in brackets z. So you can see that they're kind of different. They're not really the same, but they're similar enough. You have the x, you have the y, you have the x, the y. Here it's minus, here it's plus. Point is, you need this. Now, second thing you'll also need is to clamp this. Now, you just have an opening bracket and then comma, -0.2, comma, 0.2. So you could do it like this, or you could actually grab a clamp function and place it, but we could just keep it all within this equation or this function. So we've done this, -0.2, comma, 0.2, close. So both of these now have that clamp between -0.2 and +0.2 going into here. All these things now have to get connected. So I've placed a button here for position hold, just next to my altitude hold, connected it to the electricity. That goes there. And then our compass, we have to add, GPS Y, we have to add. The roll we're going to attach to here. And you could see that I actually went ahead and tried it and then removed it. But the pitch is going to go attached to the pitch. The roll is going to go ahead and attach to the roll. And then as well from the seat. So you can see that the W and S currently doesn't have anything. And if we think about our W and S, that's our pitch. So that's going to the pitch. And then roll is the AD, go in there. And then we'll need that GPS. Oh, I have them on the roof. So I placed the GPS up here, and I placed a compass up here. So this compass will go to the compass node. GPS Y goes to the GPS Y node. GPS X goes to the GPS X node. Nothing should get affected from normal controls until that button is pressed, and you can see I turned on 100% wind. So we're going to see if we can hover in place here without hitting into the building, and that wind is coming in strong. So if I turn on position hold, it should prevent us from drifting around. And again, if I try to press WASD, nothing will happen. I can turn this off and try to get a little closer to here as such, and turn on that position hold. Now we don't have altitude hold, but I do recommend also turning on the altitude hold for a really nice ability to actually leave the helicopter. So say you're trying to help someone out of a ship, you can have your helicopter hovering right next to the ship, and with this it should actually stay in place, both altitude and position in place. So even with the wind, you could see it's hovering in place, we're not being affected. You could turn off these systems and then off you go. So that is the sort of intermediate, advanced-ish helicopter things. I'd say that these are must-haves in any helicopter situation, but it is a difference from having a simple helicopter to having a more advanced version that has some of these features and functions. So anyway, thank you all for watching. Hopefully you learned something. As always, I'd like to thank my Discord server boosters. I'd like to thank my YouTube members. They enjoy little perks. They get early access to videos, creations, stuff like that. But I do want to thank each and every one of you for watching, for joining in and learning how to make Stormworks and pretty much apply engineering and math to make things work. And as always, do want you to enjoy the Stormworks itself, and I'll see you next time in the next video and in future creations. So until then, happy Stormworksing, everyone.